I'm going to really do a presentation of two halves. I'm going to go through the first half of the presentation fairly quickly, not lightning quick, but reasonably quickly, because I'll be talking about areas that are not to do with nuclear, but are to do with renewables, some of which will be familiar and some of which may not be. But nevertheless, I think is interesting. And one of the interesting things about one of the options is that for a particular location, some of the solutions that apply to the energy, our energy needs, can actually deliver multiple kind of benefits. It's not just a one-trick pony. And in particular, I'm going to talk about tidal lagoons in that context. The reason hopefully will become clear later what the sort of secondary benefit is, if you like. Before I go too much further, though, it may or may not be interesting for a lot of people to look at the process I start with when I'm thinking about a presentation or an issue, is to produce a mind map, because it helps you get your head around the various issues and the various points that you might want to include, without worrying about writing things down in a sort of linear way in proper sentences and so on. So that's just a bit of an insight to how my brain works, I think. But yeah, diagrams are often very helpful. What I quite like about mind maps is that it does help you to make those links or connections from one part of an issue to another. And you can obviously draw dotted lines and prioritize things. But you'll see I spent quite a lot of time thinking about the nuclear and relatively little time thinking about the other branches. So there's a sort of visual impact use as well, give you some idea of the priorities. So to start off with then, I've titled the presentation, Reasons to be Cheerful About Energy. But I think we have to get our head around a brief kind of tour of the situation we're in, and not just the short term, but also for the medium term, what the problems seem to be. Assuming that we accept that climate change is a major issue, and I'd like to think that most people would now, then we know that we cannot carry on with business as usual. Our last coal-fired power stations are due to close down in no more than 18 months' time, and are less than 5% of our generation anyway, usually less than 2%. So is there going to be enough energy? Well, clearly in the short term, the short answer should be yes, but is it the right sort of energy? Is it going to be expensive? I think that goes without saying with the latest headlines. And is it going to be dirty? And is it too dirty, in fact? So we're looking at shortage, possibly not, but is it the right sort? Is it affordable? And is it clean enough from a climate change point of view? So starting with the present crisis, we are actually at an interesting time where the grid supply in the UK, and I'm going to be mostly UK focused, obviously, the grid supply is challenged in a number of ways. And one of those is that the actual business model is changing. In the past, we've had massive power stations, of which this would be quite a small example, that would generate a lot of power and distribute it from a usually remote location to everybody else. It was a one-way traffic, big source of energy, and everybody else was a consumer. But that model is going now because we have more and more of what we call distributed energy generation. So there's lots of people like myself that have PV on the roof, probably the most common. There are lots of other sources of energy joining the grid as well. So it's got a lot more complicated to manage. We know that this is a time of change because part of that is driven by the desire to adapt. But even if we didn't want to adapt, we would have to change anyway, because the dynamics of the business model are changing. And I predict, by the way, that at some point in the future, most people in the UK will not be buying their energy by the kilowatt hour. What you'll be doing is paying probably a monthly charge for energy as a service, excuse me. And a bit like your mobile phone bill, you'll pay a certain amount every month for the convenience of having that grid there if you need it. But more and more of us are going to be generating energy locally, and more often than not, we'll be storing it as well. So the whole situation is very much changing. More wind coming online, onshore and particularly offshore. And you see I mentioned there at the bottom about battery optimization. Batteries are going to be really big news for at all sorts of scales, right from the domestic scale, such as the one I've got, to multi megawatt hour batteries that will support the grid. And indeed, Somerset is probably a leading example of a county that knows something about that. Trade associations obviously calling on the government to tackle energy crisis. Define a crisis. It is sometimes helpful to motivate people to call it a crisis, but I think it also runs the risk of creating a sort of doom and gloom mentality, when actually what we have is a series of fantastic opportunities to make a better world, literally to make a better world. We can have enough energy, we can have it cleaner, and we can tackle climate change. What we need to do is just recognize the opportunity rather than the problems. But I'm not going to read through every slide, by the way. If people want to download these and read them later, they can do, and there will be links to various sources. So we know that cost is one of the major issues, mentioned that before. I think this headline is particularly scary. 1 in 4 adults being unable to pay is not good news. So clearly we need to do something about this situation. In the short term, you could argue that's a political thing, and I'm not going to go there. But in the medium to long term, we still need to make the right choices to ensure that the energy we do deliver is going to be affordable for everybody. So before we get into how we supply energy, I think it's worth repeating that the low-hanging fruit, as they say, is definitely insulation. Instead of needing more energy, we should be actually making better use and losing less of the energy we have. So there should be clearly a great deal more work done in insulating houses, and in particularly retrofit is going to be much more of an opportunity than new houses. The vast majority of the houses that we will be living in by 2050, when we're supposed to be net zero, have already been built. So it's too late to build those to fantastically high passive house standards, but we can retrofit them and improve them dramatically. So we have heard recently about a little bit about nuclear power from the government, and it's clear that, as I say, I'm not going to get party political here. It's clear that there is more of an appetite, more support for looking at nuclear with a more favourable eye, shall we say. But I would argue that there's not just one sort of nuclear, and the sort of nuclear we have so far for civilian power generation is what I will call conventional nuclear. And I would argue that conventional nuclear is eye-wateringly expensive, complicated, overly complicated, and that there is a much better way to do it. So clearly there are lots of people highlighting this issue. And again, I've provided another link on this slide to an article that is from, that's published on an online kind of journal called Currents. I pronounce that as Currents, which I'd recommend reading if anybody's interested in energy. But again, it's just reinforcing the point that we need to make sure that our system is sustainable. We need a system where we can carry on operating it without making the world worse or indeed exacerbating climate change. But we do need to think about the infrastructure in particular. So that's not just the pylons and the cables, but that's things like more grid supporting batteries. And there is right across society support for change, but equally, I think if it wasn't already a well-made case, there is realization that we cannot go with fossil fuels any longer. So the idea that we can fix the medium to long-term energy supply issue by drilling or fracking or any of that kind of thing is frankly a nonsense. If anybody wants to debate that with me at another time, then we can do that. But I think that's pretty well accepted. So we're in a situation where things are inconvenient. I don't really need to state that even now with energy supply, we're finding that inconvenient. The other day we had one of the impacts, arguably, of at least partially due to climate change. We had a 7-hour power cut. That's pretty inconvenient. Bit less so for myself because I had a battery, which begs the question of, should there be more batteries? But whatever we look at, we are looking at the need to adapt, and change, whether we like it or not, is coming. So yeah, even august publications such as the Daily Mail have accepted that. I think that was quite an interesting. It's quite interesting to note how publications that have in the past been less than sympathetic to renewables or even climate change have actually changed their stance. So even on eBay, people are looking for renewable solutions. By the way, I would not, for most people, recommend self-installation unless you're pretty clued up. There are some quite good reasons for not only the legality of grid-connected systems, but also the fact that it can affect your house insurance. So I would always recommend that you go to a registered installer, as they say. But nevertheless, inquiries are on the increase everywhere. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it, as I said, in terms of the conventional renewable solutions and offerings, but I will press on fairly quickly to some aspects of wind that you might not be familiar with, and tidal lagoons. Just briefly worth mentioning there that heat pumps are going to be an increasing option for a lot of people in terms of zero emissions technology, at least at the point of use. And they're going to be a much cleaner way to heat our buildings. They are appealing for a lot of people because they are the nearest thing we have at the moment to a kind of plug and play replacement for gas boilers. But just in case you think it's the kind of issue that's only advocated by people who are involved in it or advocates for particular technology and so on. Bloomberg NEF is a finance organization. So anybody who knows anything about the city will know that these are not sentimental people, and they are not partisan. They will look purely and first and foremost at the finance side of things. And the quote there is from a lady called Jenny Chase, who is, as it says, one of their senior analysts, who said that wind and solar alone will not get us to net zero by 2050. So just to repeat, this is not the opinion of somebody who's from a political party or has a particular passion about a particular aspect of renewables, etc. This is purely and simply based on a person who is very intelligent and has analyzed the situation from the point of view of what will and won't work and what's affordable. So, okay, what do we do about that? Well, fortunately, we're not actually in a situation where renewables is our only choice. It is worth stating, by the way, that if you were to say to me, can we run the UK on 100% renewable generation 365 days of the year, I would say, yes, absolutely, no problem. If you ask me whether we can do it by 2050, I would say no. Or the longer answer is no. There isn't enough time to get the infrastructure in place and the equipment in place and all the other things that need to be in place to convert entirely to renewable generation. Not by 2050. Without something else, we are not going to make our net zero commitment. And come back to me in 2050 if you think I've made a prediction there that is open to challenge. So, nevertheless, we're going to have to do certain things that do get us along that road to eventually being able to power ourselves by completely zero emissions technology. And yeah, I personally am passionate about renewable energy, but I'm also a pragmatist. So anyway, I mentioned tidal lagoons. That's essentially enclosing part of a bay with some kind of wall, and you put turbines in the wall, and you can generate on 4 times a day because there are 2 incoming and 2 outgoing tides, obviously. So there have been various suggestions about tidal lagoons around the UK. Probably more famous would be the Swansea Bay tidal lagoon scheme that was quite hot probably 2 or 3 years ago. It's gone a bit cooler now, but it's still around. It's still being advocated by some people. Less commonly talked about is the idea of enclosing Bridgewater Bay. And I said earlier that there can be more than one reason to do that. And the reason, I think, is very obvious to anybody who knows the levels well. The levels are to a large extent drained by the 2 main rivers, the Tone, which drains into the Parrett, and the Parrett drains into the Severn Estuary, obviously. If you have an enclosure of part or all of Bridgewater Bay, you could, when you predict there's going to be a particularly high tide, keep the sluice gates closed. You could hold the incoming tide outside of the Bay area, and thus allow the Parrett to drain into that lagoon and use it as a kind of relief system, if you like, so that if the rivers continue to drain, you don't get the flooding of the levels that you otherwise would. That wouldn't be normal operation, but it is an option to manage the flood risk for something that would otherwise be a generating facility, but as I say, brings you that secondary benefit. So it's a bit difficult to kind of price things if you have to explain to people that, yes, the ticket might look quite high. If I said that was, X billion pounds, you might say, yeah, that's a bit steep. But if you say, yes, but it's not just a power station, it's also a flood avoidance scheme, if you like. So that's an interesting point to keep in mind. Another thing that I think is worth drawing to people's attention is that the cooperation that's possible between, if you like, the individual, the market, and the state is an interesting one. And again, and I think it's useful to put party politics on one side and just say that there are certain things that different parts of society do well. And if you get that perfect marriage, if you like, of those different sectors, you can get some great things happening. This is an example of, I would suggest, one of those. If you wanted to have a wind turbine on your own home, for most of us, it's not practical. It's quite possible the neighbours wouldn't like it. And in any case, if you try to do it at too small a scale, they're not economic. They don't yield enough energy, and they are too expensive for what you get back. However, this is where we come to the benefits of the inverse square law. If you make your diameter of your turbine twice as big, you don't get twice as much energy, you get 8 times as much energy. So you get a lot more energy if you go big. But where do you put them? And in any case, for some people, it's not possible because of living in the wrong sort of property. If you've got a thatched cottage, or you live in a flat or rented accommodation, what can you do about that? What this company has done, it's a company called Ripple Energy. And what they do is build and install wind farms. And then they sell shares in the turbines to individual owners. The owners can buy a share in what becomes then a cooperative that owns and manages the turbines. So whatever that turbine generates is then sold on the wholesale market, and the profit is credited to your energy account. So even if you live in rented accommodation or in a flat or something, that gives you the chance to have the benefits of some renewable generation, and it doesn't have to be where you live. You can be anywhere in the UK and be a member of one of their cooperatives. So I think that's just a new business model, if you like, a new idea that is going to be interesting to hopefully a lot of people, and a good example of how business, individuals, and to some extent the state in facilitating it can actually bring about some good results. So again, future-facing solution, I think. And you can see that they do have a number of videos you can go and watch and find out more about it. They've got a very interesting FAQ and a sort of question and answer page. But nevertheless, as I said before, even if we crack on as best at the best possible rate for installing wind turbines and solar PV, and even if we add to that tidal stream turbines, which is different technology, of course, and wave energy and all of those other things, it's going to take quite a lot of time to actually get the infrastructure in place. So we are still faced with a shortage. But I'm suggesting there that nuclear, which I've mentioned before, is a useful way of not just filling that gap, but even in the distant future, when we get to 2050, if we suddenly say, you know what, we can actually run everything by renewables, I still think there's a case for having a number of nuclear power stations, and well, actually, there are many reasons for that. I've mentioned one or two of them in this presentation, but there are actually quite a few. We could use it to synthesize liquid fuels for long-haul flights, as it says there. Why would you do that when we've got, you know, more than enough fossil fuel that we could just dig up? Well, the answer is in the word fossil. The climate change situation is made worse by adding to the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. If you synthesize fuels using carbon that you have taken from the atmosphere and combining that with hydrogen that you generate renewably, you end up with a hydrocarbon that you can then use in conventional aircraft and not be adding to the total amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So there's a good case for doing that. But as I also mentioned there, we will be living in a world where, not just because of climate change, but also because of you know, population growth, etc., we are already witnessing water stress in many parts of the world. So we need more fresh drinking water. Most of the water on the planet is not actually fit to drink as it is. So we'll end up desalinating more and more water for human beings. And where's the energy for that going to come from? And I would argue one of the easiest and most straightforward ways to get that is also from nuclear. So as I mentioned before, we do have these choices. I would advocate that one of those is nuclear. And I've also put an indication about the medical advantages. Even if you could eliminate the need for electricity generation by nuclear, if you could generate it all from renewables, I'm afraid, as big a fan as I am of renewables, you can't get certain medical isotopes any other way. Molybdenum-99, for those who are interested, decays to technetium-99, and technetium-99 is used in thousands of hospitals around the world for various scans and cancer treatments. So you know, where's that isotope going to come from if you close down all the nuclear power stations? So there's a challenging point. Even if you didn't need it for the energy, you do need it for other reasons. So that's fine. I think I've at least opened a debate to say, well, there is a case to be made for some nuclear. You could argue that you maybe don't need more than, say, 10% of your energy to come from nuclear, but it's quite useful if that 10% is there. But the problem is that conventional nuclear has all these issues. It's, as I said, eye-wateringly expensive, and it is actually quite technically complex. If we look at the power stations being built at the moment, Hinkley Point C, I think that is, you know, what is it, 3-4 times its original price tag, and I'd be surprised if it actually kept to the latest estimate either. The reality is that there is, to my knowledge at least, no nuclear power station in the world that has ever actually made a profit. So that's a thought. Well, why do it then? I would argue that there is a case for doing it for having medical isotopes, if nothing else. But nevertheless, conventional nuclear is a problem because it's big, expensive, and complicated. And it gets worse. There are byproducts of conventional nuclear that are around for a very long time. And I think it's no secret to say that we have not yet, at least not globally, and certainly not in this country, agreed about long-term storage of the waste products from the conventional nuclear reactors. There are a number of different types of reactors, as you can see on the screen there, just giving you a quick snapshot of half a dozen of them. But they are all relatively complicated and expensive. And one of the reasons they're expensive is that most, well, arguably all of the reactors that are in operation at the moment use water as a coolant and a heat transfer medium, if you like. And part of the problem with water is that you may have noticed it boils at normal atmospheric pressure. It boils at 100 degrees Celsius and turns to steam. But steam is a terrible way of actually transferring heat from one way to another. Its ability to carry heat energy is very poor. So you have to pressurize it to keep it in its liquid state. And that's fine. You can then go much higher. But in order to get up to the sort of temperatures that conventional reactors will be operating at, you have to pressurize it a lot. And we are talking somewhere between 70, at least 70 atmospheres. Some reactors in the world actually go as much as 200 atmospheres. That is scarily high pressure. If you get even the slightest leak at those pressures, you've got a really bad day at the office. Because as soon as pressurized water is released to normal atmospheric pressure, it will immediately, instantaneously flash to steam. And that steam will occupy roughly 1,000 times the volume that it did as a liquid. And that's the main reason why you have these secondary containment buildings that are, the size of cathedrals. Because if there were a leak of that kind, you want to keep that steam in. It's going to contain things that you don't want escaping to the atmosphere. So why do we do conventional nuclear? I'm not going to dwell too long on it, but there are some hints at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there. Long story short, conventional reactors mostly run on uranium fuel, and they produce plutonium. Plutonium's quite handy if you like to make a big bang. And most, not all, but most of the conventional reactors require what they call enrichment to make the uranium more, the right sort of uranium, more concentrated in the fuel they're supplied with. You put them through a process where you actually produce enriched uranium to go into the reactor, and a waste product of that is something called depleted uranium, which is interesting stuff. And we're seeing it used, sadly, at the moment in certain weapons that will knock out tanks. Again, not getting political there, but you may have an opinion on that, which, that's something that some people you would see as a negative side of the conventional nuclear business, for want of a better phrase. But what if I was to say to you that it doesn't have to be that way? There are, many ways you can build reactors, and they do not have to be fueled by uranium-235, which, by the way, is the fissile form of uranium that most of them like to use, most of the conventional ones. There are other elements that you can use to fuel a reactor. And the one that we're going to talk about now is thorium. Now, thorium is interesting stuff. It is, in fact, not fissile. If you put thorium into a reactor, it doesn't work very well if you just put it in as it comes. However, if you supply it with extra neutrons, if you fire a load of neutrons at it, it will change. It goes through a series of changes from thorium-232, which is the abundant form that we've got so much of in the world, we will never run out of it. It changes from thorium-232 to thorium-233, then to protactinium-233, and then eventually it becomes uranium-233, which is a slightly different element, obviously, from different isotope, I beg your pardon, from uranium-235, but uranium-233 is fissile, and this will now keep your chain reaction going in your reactor and produce the heat that will drive the turbines, etc. So you can start with thorium and convert it into different element that you can then use to run your reactor. And you might say, well, hang on, we didn't want uranium, but this form of uranium, for reasons I'm not going to go into tonight, because it's a bit of a long-winded explanation, that form of uranium is useless for the purposes of making nuclear weapons. You simply wouldn't use it. It's a damp squib, frankly. Think of it as damp squib. So you don't, from the sort of reactors I'm going to talk about in a moment, you don't get depleted uranium because you don't start with uranium. You don't need to produce the nasty byproducts, if you like, and you don't get the nasty waste products. One thing you do need, though, for molten salt reactors, which is what the thorium reactors are that I would recommend. What you do need is some other elements that you would put together and make into this molten salt. One part of that is lithium. And people often say, yeah, but look at where lithium comes from. Well, I would suggest that there are better ways to get lithium. And if you want to be patriotic, what better than getting it from Cornwall? There's a company called Cornish Lithium that, as we speak, is exploring and extracting in a sort of pilot program. And that, honestly, it's really worth checking out their website. I've given you a link there, that they are going to be one of the most environmentally friendly operations in the world. It is literally world leading, the way they're proposing to operate. So they're making use of something that's already there. They drill a hole that's honestly no bigger than your arm, and that's all you see at the surface. It's a very clean and green way to actually get at this stuff. They extract a liquid in the form of a brine. They extract the lithium and they put the rest straight back down again. So it's very it's environmentally friendly way of doing it. So a couple of video links there that you a link to the Cornish Lithium website and the fully charged YouTube video that you may find interesting if you want to investigate that. So that's one of the elements that you would need. You actually need fluoride, lithium, and beryllium, but there are ethical ways to get all of them. So it turns out that there is an alternative sort of reactor that, as I say, is safer, cheaper, and uses more abundant fuel, etc. One of the companies working on these molten salt reactors is a company called Thorcon. And just to give you an idea of scale, you can see this sort of tugboat or whatever it is on the right-hand side there. The thing on the left, although you only got an end view of it, is it's a ship, but it's a ship that's a nuclear power station. And their idea is that this will mean that they can mass produce the reactors in shipyards, tow them out to wherever they're needed around the world, and the majority of human populations are reasonably close to a coastal site where these things could be anchored. They could be right on the shoreline, they could be a little way out to sea. But something the size that you see there would produce probably, it's around 450 or 500 megawatts. So that's enough for a small city, I would suggest. So a little bit about the sort of fuel options, if you like, for a molten salt reactor. There are, in fact, three kind of pathways that you could use, but only one of those is, in my opinion at least, is the one that we should go for, is option 3. For the reasons stated on the right, no uranium mining would be necessary, no enrichment would be necessary. And this also makes them attractive, by the way, for not just the UK, but for anywhere in the world where you might be worried about the nuclear proliferation or the weaponizable side of things. Essentially, these reactors are simply not suitable for being weaponized. They're also very safe in terms of being proof against random impacts from missiles, aircraft, etc. They're built to withstand any kind of unwanted impact. So yeah, option 3 is, as it says there, a thermal spectrum molten salt reactor. Thermal just means that you have slowed down the neutrons that are released when you split the atoms to a speed where they're more likely to continue this chain reaction that we want, because that's what gives us the heat. There are a number of different ways of operating reactors. Not going to spend too much time on this, I think, but it's safe to say that the most favorable way to operate one efficiently and a way that would ensure that the amount of thorium we have available now in the world would last us for probably, well, we're talking in the thousands of years. If you powered the entire world, we have enough thorium to operate the entire world exclusively on reactor. Not that I'm recommending that, but we could operate exclusively on nuclear energy for over 1,000 years. So that's a little bit more about the material itself. You'll see that one of the reasons that it's stable and safe, I'm not going to go through every point there, but the half-life of thorium-90, which is or thorium-232, which is the common form, is over 14 billion years. Just to put that in context, all the Earth still has pretty much all of the thorium it started with 4.5 billion years ago. So the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years old. We haven't even got through one half-life of thorium yet. It's so stable, it will just sit there. And in fact, in its the form that you could extract it from the ground or wherever, you could walk around with a pocket full of thorium for the rest of your life and feel no ill effects whatsoever. I've said a couple of times, I think it's abundant supply. There is approximately, depends on who you speak to, approximately 3 to 5 times as much thorium in the world as there is uranium, which is what we're using now. But the interesting thing is that if you operate a liquid fluoride thorium reactor in the mode I just indicated, you can actually breed more fuel. So you would not even consume what we have unless you wanted to. It depends on how you operate it as to what it will do, obviously. What you can do with a lifter reactor, however, is you can use the existing stockpile of waste that is not yet buried, sitting around at places like Sellafield, etc. You could use some of that, process it, and include that a small amount of it with the thorium fuel, as part of the molten salt mixture that carrying the thorium fuel. You can include a little bit of your waste material to provide a source of neutrons that would get the thing started. So over time, if you choose to do that, you could in fact so-called burn up or transmute that a lot of that nuclear stockpile of waste that we've got at the moment into safer elements. And in fact, instead of having to think of storing waste for thousands of years, probably 24,000 years in excess in some cases, you would have a much smaller amount, as in probably 5% or less, of waste that would actually only need to be stored for less than 300 years or thereabouts. So less waste and much shorter storage problem. So yeah, abundant supply. It's also worth drawing your attention to the part on the right-hand side of the diagram there, where I've reminded us that we're going to need to desalinate water in the future for a large part of the population. So places like Cape Town, for example, could have one of those Thorcon reactors moored in the harbour, very safe reactors, so you don't need to put it miles away. But that would produce from seawater, it would produce the drinking water that that city needs. And I think we probably, you may already remember those stories that they had the so-called zero-day water situation, didn't they? Where they very nearly literally ran out of water for people to drink. What this would mean is that that problem would be solved as well. That's just my idea of what's in view. I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but I just find, for those of us of a certain age, will remember Joe 90, and I just wonder if there was a little joke there somewhere with the people who wrote that series. That 90 is the so-called atomic number of thorium, so that's how many protons it's got in the nucleus. So there you go, a little bit of fun mention there. This is the website of the version, if you like, of thorium reactor that I particularly like. I like because of its relative simplicity, but there are a number of other reasons, like the fact that you can operate it continuously for many years, and that it is, I think, a particularly safe design for reasons that I can mention in a minute. This chap is a guy called Kirk Sorensen, who is one of the, I don't know if he's actually the managing director or the CEO, but he's certainly one of the important people at Flive Energy. I think the interesting thing to note about him is he is in fact ex-NASA. So again, a very, very knowledgeable man about a large number of things, including the engineering of it, but also acutely aware of the need to design systems that are very, very, very safe. And if you're launching something into space, you don't want anything to go wrong. It has to be reliable. It must not fail. But nevertheless, as I say, the design of reactor that they've pioneering through his company, the so-called lifter, LFTR, pronounced lifter, is inherently safe in its design. And there are a number of YouTube videos that you can see I've provided links to if you want to learn a bit more about it in your own time. So many advantages. Where do I start? One of the advantages is that the Flive Energy lifter reactor does not produce transuranics, as they're called. These are the quite nasty products that are, transuranics just means basically heavier than uranium, and therefore quite very, very liable to fission, as they say. So they would, basically the nucleus would split, and you get all sorts of things going on when that happens. But transuranics are a problem in terms of reactor operation, because you don't want them really. As I mentioned earlier, there are some people who do quite like to use plutonium, but outside of, for civilian power purposes, it's a bit of a nuisance, to be honest. Some of these other elements are also difficult. And one of the reasons they're difficult is that they kind of mess up the fuel. One of the reasons that conventional nuclear is so kind of poor is that you have to, you put the fuel in solid form, and then that fuel gets kind of contaminated with these unwanted products that are formed as part of normal operation. And you can't easily get those things out of the reactor core. So after a certain point, sooner rather than later, you have to take the fuel out, stick it on one side, and you might only have got 5 or 6 or 7% of the energy, probably a lot less, sometimes less than 1% of the energy you started with, actually out of the fuel. Contrast that with the liquid fluoride thorium reactor, where you can get, in theory, over 90% of the original energy out of the fuel. So again, it's going to be much more economic and efficient. And the reason you can do that is that the way the lifter reactors operate is that you constantly remove those unwanted byproducts of fission, if you like. It's like you can think of the processing that takes part outside the reactor core in a lifter reactor as a bit like the kidneys in your body. You're cleaning up this liquid that's carrying your fuel and getting rid of the things you don't want. Things like xenon-135, which soaks up the neutrons. You don't want to soak up the neutrons. You want those to carry keep the chain reaction going. You can remove that during the normal operation as the fluid is pumped around. So they are simpler. You can see there, that's the sort of two fluid reactor model, as they call it. Again, probably don't need to go into too much detail. I will show you another diagram later, but essentially it's a bit like an indirect cylinder, if you like. The molten salt that is going through the reactor core goes to a heat exchanger, and then another fluid will actually carry that heat energy to, in their design, actually a gas turbine. And we all know that gas turbines work because that's what we fly around the skies with. Your jet aeroplane is a gas turbine. That's what a jet engine is. So, and another reason for liking nuclear, the capacity factor. It's worth just harking back to the capacity factor. It's just like saying how much of the time, what percentage of the time is a generator actually working. If you look at the table on the right-hand side, you'll see that wind, you're doing well if it's producing at its maximum rate, say 37% of the time, that would be doing pretty well. Solar thermal, a bit less than that. Solar PV, you're looking at a quarter of the time if you're lucky. With a nuclear power station, of course, it's, as I said before, could be over 90% of the time. And that's an average now, by the way. That would be even higher with the lifter reactors. That's based on conventional nuclear. So they are on most of the time. But the lifter reactor, interestingly, would be on even more because you don't need to shut it down to refuel it. You refuel it as it's going along. Whereas the conventional sort, you have to actually shut them down for a week or two and change, usually maybe a quarter or a third of the fuel in the core, and then crank it back up again. And while it's down and offline, there's nothing you can. If you suddenly need more power, you can't just switch it on instantly. So it's nice to have it available more of the time. Lifter reactors much more reliable. I mentioned safety earlier. Why is it safe? Well, one of the reasons is that if you think of some of the things that go wrong with things like Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima Daiichi, they were all conventional nuclear. And part of the problem with conventional nuclear is that you get, as I said before, byproducts formed in the fuel that will produce heat long after you have shut the reactor down. So you have to keep cooling the core for a long time. If you don't, then it gets hot, obviously. And remember, those conventional reactors have water associated as used as a cooling fluid. And if you get water hot, too hot, it will dissociate into oxygen and hydrogen. And if you have hydrogen and a lot of heat and oxygen all together, it's not a good day at the office. In contrast, the lifter reactors that Clive Energy and others are working on, liquid fluoride, it's a liquid. So under normal operation, as you can see from the graphic in the middle there, beneath the kind of loop that's going through the core carrying this molten salt is what they call a freeze plug. So it's a very simple device. It's essentially just a bit of pipe, if you like, that has some material in it that is in its solid form. And it's solid because they use material that will be solid at a suitable temperature if you keep blowing a cooling fan on it. So if this sort of reactor lost all power, as happened at Fukushima, what would happen is the fan would stop blowing, the material inside the pipe would melt, and then everything drains down into what they call a drain tank under gravity. So you don't need any external power for pumping. Once that liquid, that molten salt mixture drains down into the drain tank is passively cooling it. So it doesn't need any sort of power to do that. It will just radiate the heat out and dissipate it into the ground around it. Usually they're buried low down or even underground by however many feet is necessary, and surrounded by a fair bit of material. So it's completely safe. So if the reactor was, for example, swamped by a tsunami, what would happen is it would just shut down. It would just stop working. And that would be it. It would be a complete non-event. There would be no release. Nothing would get overheated, because as soon as you take the fuel out of the core, it's away from the source of those extra neutrons, because you also need the something called a moderator in there to help slow down those neutrons. So you've not got any suitable slow neutrons. You haven't got the decay heat, because remember, we remove those unwanted parts from that circulating fluid, unlike the conventional nuclear. So you haven't got decay heat, you haven't got the primary reaction going on either. So it just literally goes cold. Within a matter of days or weeks, it would be, stone cold, and I'd quite happily have a picnic on top of one of these things after it had been shut down like that. It's that safe. It would, in fact, as I say, if these had been installed at Fukushima Daiichi, we wouldn't have a news story. So, okay, oops. Just a little bit more information there about the way that drains down under gravity, as I said. And essentially that's saying what I just said. You don't need external power. If there is a catastrophic event, it is literally fail safe. You don't need human intervention. You don't need it would literally just stop. End of story. Stop, go cold, non-event. I've said it's cheaper. Part of the reason it's cheaper is that it's so abundant, but it's not just that. It gets even better. The thorium that you need firstly, there are massive stockpiles of it already for reasons not going to go into. We have literally many thousands of tons of thorium sitting around doing nothing. There is, to my knowledge, somewhere between 35 and 50,000 tons of it buried in the United States alone doing nothing. Secondly, you can obtain it from mine tailings, because you get thorium wherever you get the so-called rare earth minerals. So wherever they've had mines extracting the rare earth minerals to make into your smartphone or your iPhone or your laptop or whatever, those mines exist already. There are quite large amounts of mine tailings sitting next to most of those mines, and you could process those mine tailings and extract the thorium from that. You don't even need to do any new mining at all. So I said before that it's not suitable for weapons. Essentially, if you wanted fissile material, you would not choose one of these reactors. They are rubbish for making that. They make the wrong sort. It doesn't work, essentially. If you want plutonium, you simply wouldn't use this sort of reactor. So, and there is no depleted uranium. So really a non-event from a weapons point of view. Bit of a different view there, but you get the idea of what they call a two fluid or a secondary loop. That's quite a good way, I think, of visualizing the idea that the molten salt is going around the left-hand side there through the reactor core, extracting heat through the heat exchanger, transferring that to the second stage there. It goes through another heat exchanger, and then in the Flive Energy design, it's actually used to heat a gas. By the way, that gas is also quite benign. It's mostly carbon dioxide, but it's sealed. It's not. It's quite safe. So you can use essentially carbon dioxide to run your gas turbine, and out pops the electricity. And just a reminder that it's worth mentioning that there is a little person. If you look on the scale on the left-hand side, that's probably a reasonable representation of the sort of scale that you would probably build something like maybe a 500 megawatt version at. However, if you wanted and needed to, you could make them a lot smaller, and you could make them bigger. It's much less constrained in its size than conventional nuclear reactor is. You don't need to build them as big as they are at Hinkley Point, for example. But having said that, if you go too small, the economics get less favorable. It's fair to say that. So again, a quick reminder that, as I said, gas turbines would be used in the Flive Energy version. Why is it a good idea to use a gas turbine and that sort of setup? One of the reasons, without getting too technical, is that it helps to guarantee, if you like, that you won't get the escape of something called tritium. Again, that's a product of all reactors. And long story short, you don't want tritium getting out into the atmosphere. But if you use a gas turbine, that essentially makes sure that you don't. An interesting kind of link there to another video. So, and a reminder that modular construction means that most of these parts can actually be, well, all of them essentially, can be produced, mass produced in a factory, unlike the situation that you've got at Hinkley Point and conventional nuclear, where most of it's built on site, which is much more expensive and more subject to delays for weather and all the rest of it. all of which increases the cost. So modular construction is something that keeps costs down. And I mentioned before that it's scalable. The scale that's appropriate for the different designs depends on the company. Thorcon are concentrating on the sort of ship scale, if you like. Fleib's lifter, probably a little bit smaller than a ship size, but can be bigger or smaller as the need arises. And I've just finished there with a quick reminder of some of the abbreviations that you might hear used in some of those videos, things like low enriched uranium, MSR for molten salt reactor, and so on. What I didn't mention earlier was that there is another option for a liquid thorium, liquid thorium reactor called an ADSR, so accelerator-driven subcritical reactor. That just means that instead of seeding the fuel with some material that's already going to give you those extra neutrons, you can put in essentially pure thorium, but supply the extra neutrons with the particle accelerator. And in principle, that has been proved somewhere in the UK. They used a particle accelerator to prove that. It's not likely, as far as I know, that there will be a commercial version that is of an ADSR anytime soon, which is why I haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. But there is very, I think, a good reason to suppose that the lifter reactor from Fleib Energy should be available, hopefully within the next 5 years. So it's not that far away. Moltex, Canadian company, also similar timescale. Thorcon, a little bit more difficult to get the timescale out of them. Yeah, sorry, I had a battery issue on my headset there. Okay, so I'm nearly finished, but I just thought it was useful to have those links to those 3 main companies if people want to check them out.